Welcome to Apologetics from the Attic, the show that seeks to teach and defend the Christian faith in a post-Christian culture. And now, broadcasting from an attic in an undisclosed location somewhere outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, here is your host, Dave Lewis. Hey everyone, this is Dave Lewis. Welcome to another edition of Apologetics from the Attic. Sorry I've been off for a little while. I didn't post an episode since 2 Saturdays ago maybe, but I'm back, and today I wanted to talk about an idea I had for a show that I want to start producing weekly if I can, and I want to call it the Prophetic View. Now, it's kind of clickbaity, it's kind of, the word prophetic, but I want to do a news show where I go over current events from a biblical Christian Reformed perspective. Now, Dave, aren't there any of those out there already? Well, you got Al Mohler's The Briefing, which I enjoy, although I haven't listened to it as regularly as I used to. I used to listen to The Briefing way back when he was still on the regular radio. That was very formative for me. I was young in the faith, listening to Al Mohler, and there's a song his theme song is stuck in my head. When I listened to it, it was very nostalgic. Actually, I forget why I listened to some old Albert Mohler. Anyway, so Al Mohler does that, but I found now there could be other shows out there that I haven't found, but I haven't found ones that really satisfy me, that we're talking about the theological perspectives behind current events. Like, where's God? The relationship of the sovereignty of God and the free human choices of men and women in politics, in current events, in coronavirus, in the riots. How do those things relate? So for me, and then that's the next question. Where do you get your news? Because everything is curated for you, meaning that no matter where you go, unless you're going to go out on the street and, find the news yourself, it's always coming to you secondhand, and mainly through the internet. So, if you're watching on my screen, I have Fox News. So here's foxnews.com. You get your news there. And then, of course, the other extreme. These are the two classic extremes that are put out there: Fox News, and then you got CNN, right? And then I don't know if you're familiar with Drudge Report. So Drudge, and he made his name by breaking the news of the Monica Lewinsky scandal with Bill Clinton. And Drudge Report, if you're not familiar with it, it's an interesting concept, and like one of the most simple websites ever designed, because all it is a bunch of links that you click on to other news sources, so a news aggregator. But see, Drudge curates stuff for you. So what he decides to put in these big headlines, like here's the breaking news this morning, I guess: Melania used private email account while in White House. Like, oh no. But she's not the Secretary of State. That's the difference. But anyway, and you'll see Drudge's slanting things, and then you go through. Drudge Report's interesting because you could just get in one glance quite a bit of news and quite a bit of things that are going on of current events. And then, of course, Twitter. Lots of people get their news on Twitter nowadays. You follow the people that you want to follow on Twitter, and you get your news there. And then Facebook, of course, is another place where news pops up from time to time. So, that's the one thing. So we would go through some of these current events. I'd curate them for you, kind of. But, I'd go over the biggest news of the week and analyze it. Now, what do you mean analyze it? How do you analyze the news? Now, so this is the key. So how can I bring something unique that isn't out there? So one of my ideas, and the reason I want to call it the Prophetic View, is that I want to go from the biblical standpoint of two things. How do the prophets of Israel, especially Isaiah to the end of the canon, so Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the Book of the 12, the minor prophets, they're traditionally called the Book of the 12, which the reason it's called the Book of the 12 is because it was originally just one book in the corpus of the Old Testament prophets. But I wanted to read this paragraph, and this really got my juices flowing for this program that I want to call the Prophetic View, and I want to brand it separately. I'll still post it on the same YouTube channel, I think. Although, maybe I should make a new YouTube channel. I don't know yet. But I want to, get people to, when they're searching for current events and want to know more about them, that they could stumble upon it from a Christian worldview perspective, Reform worldview perspective, and learn theology through it. But anyway, this is Calvin, and this is his volume 7 in this set of his commentaries on Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 1 to 32. This is commentary on prophet Isaiah. And I was reading through the introduction to it, and here's this paragraph. Check this paragraph out. This paragraph is really, really cool. And this paragraph encapsulates part of what I wanted to do for this concept. Calvin says, quote, "Hence we may learn in what manner the doctrine of the word should be handled, and that we ought to imitate the prophets who conveyed the doctrine of the law in such a manner as to draw from it advices, reproofs, threatenings, and consolations, which they applied to the present condition of the people." So Calvin's saying that this is what how should we imitate the prophets? Well, we extract from the doctrine of the law the advices, reproofs, threatenings, and consolations, and they were applied to the people. That's what the prophets did. And then listen to this important sentence. "For although we do not daily receive a revelation of what we are to utter as a prediction," so many times when you hear the term prophecy or prophetic, you think about Nostradamus and people making predictions of the future, and that's prophecy. That's not what Calvin's going to say it is. Listen to what he says. So he's saying that's not what we're doing. But here's what he says. "Yet, it is of high importance to us to compare the behavior of the men of our own age with the behavior of that ancient people, and from their histories and examples we ought to make known the judgments of God, such as that what formerly punished, he will also punish with equal severity in our own day, for he is always like himself. Such wisdom let godly teachers acquire, if they would wish to handle the doctrine of the prophets with any good result." So we study the prophets to compare the behavior of men of our own age with the behavior of that ancient people, and from their histories and examples we ought to make known the judgments of God. So that's pretty cool, right? We want to compare, so we want to study Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. We want to understand and study the ancient people of Israel, because this is a theonoustos history. So the only God-breathed, God-inspired history that we possess is in the Holy Scriptures. And so no other interpretation of history that we have, okay, is God-inspired or God-breathed. So we study the Scriptures in order to say this is the God-inspired view of history and the behavior of ancient people, and this is how God responded to it. And we apply that to our current events. I thought that was powerful. And that's one of the tasks I want to do on this new programming called the Prophetic View. Now, I want to continue to do, I got a lot of work to do on the doctrine of the Trinity, the deity of Christ, doctrine of justification, free will, compatibilism, those issues. And then I still want to dip my toes in dealing with Mormonism, Roman Catholicism, Islam, oneness Pentecostalism, do classical apologetic work defending the faith, atheism. So we still want to do that as well. But I really want to be a voice for current events. Now, where else do I get my news? Well, I listen to Ben Shapiro a lot. I like him. All the classic, Rush Limbaugh, I'll catch him if I'm driving around, Glenn Beck, Michael Savage, any of those, because I'm conservative. I'll just put my cards on the table. I am more of a conservative Christian. But I've also been the type of person who, over the years, I will watch CNN. I will listen to I have, like, in my podcast list, I have Meet the Press with Chuck Todd. I'll check out what he's got to say every Sunday. I'll check out, this guy, Tim Pool. I don't even know how I connected with him recently, but I like him a lot. And he's more of a liberal type guy, younger guy, but he's voting for Trump. And there's this whole thing. You should check him out. He's done with voting for Democrats because of the riots. This is his big thing. And he thinks that Joe Biden isn't going to even help with the riots, and it's going to get worse under him. And he's going to vote for Trump, even though he said he would never vote for Trump, and he can't stand Trump in a lot of ways, but he's going to vote for him anyway. But anyway, that kind of thing. So, that's important. Where do you get your news? Because you'll notice a lot of people, they don't go across a broad sweep to get their news. And unfortunately, in our day and age, you kind of have to. And then, the intellectual dark web, they've called it. But, you have the internet, which totally changed how we consume news. Because before the internet, you had the newspapers, right? You had the New York Times, you had the Washington Post, you had the LA Times, and then your local newspaper maybe, and then you had the Associated Press, which would which still is in a way a clearinghouse of major news stories that local papers would, I think they pay the Associated Press to put those stories in their papers to fill in content. And then of course you had ABC, NBC, CBS, you had your PBS, you had your public news. Those were your only sources of news. And then when the internet came, so they kind of had a monopoly. And then the internet came out, and now you have like YouTube. This is the platform that I'm using, YouTube and podcasting, and like the ability to even set up my setup right here with this microphone and a computer with a webcam, and the ability to record is revolutionary. And then the internet just blew everything out of the water. So now you don't have to just go to the major networks to get your news. Now, this can be kind of dangerous because you can get right-wing stuff, left-wing stuff. You can get conspiracy theory stuff now. Like, back in the day, before internet, the only way to get right-wing and left-wing conspiracy theory stuff is you had to have a subscription to a weird magazine and stuff like that. And they had weird conspiracy theory magazines that you could buy. But the it's interesting. So, and one other thing I want to talk about. So this is a shorter episode, just to announce. What's our time here? Just to announce this. I don't want this to be a super long episode, but just to announce some of these things. But I wanted to talk about a Christian worldview briefly, and where we're going to go for that is, N.T. Wright. So this is part of his series, the Christian Origins and the Question of God, I think, and this is his big series that has, I think it's up to 4 volumes now, because he releases one on Paul, I think last year, but this one's called The New Testament and the People of God. This is volume 1, and this is where he really lays out a lot of his foundations of how he thinks, his epistemology, his view of history, et cetera, et cetera. But he has a really good section on worldview that I want to read together. And this is what I also want to see that, and this is what people are doing on these news programs. And, you know, the distinction between hard news and commentary is kind of blurred. And, you know, many will say that much of the media is propaganda and they report the news. Now, the news has always been reported, obviously, with through the lens of the reporter. But, you know, it's definitely true that you can report the news with the attempt, anyway, at objectivity and just here are the facts and let people interpret the facts the way they want, and report the news in a way where you are selectively editing the facts, only reporting what you want to do, which definitely goes on. Media bias is a problem, you know, on both sides. But you know, if you're from the conservative side, you would, you know, the drumbeat of the major news networks, or as Rush would call them, the drive-by media, the lamestream media. There's all kinds of stuff, man. It's an interesting when you get into this, you know. But we're all trying to express our worldview, and a worldview is de facto functioning in your thinking, whether you realize it or not. So, but if you're blindly functioning out of a worldview and you're not aware of it, that can be a problem. So to start bringing out, what does it mean to have a worldview? What the heck is worldview? And there's been books written on this. There's been stuff, but it's something you should definitely think about. What is a worldview? Before you even say, what is my worldview, what is a worldview in general? Okay, so here's what Wright says. Worldviews have to do with the presuppositional, precognitive stage of culture or society. So presuppositional and precognitive. Okay? So in other words, it's behind the scenes. It's a presupposition you carry into. It's like a pair of glasses that you wear, that you look through those glasses to see the world and see reality. Wherever we find the ultimate concerns of human beings, we find worldviews. So ultimate concerns, very important. From that point of view, as the echo of Paul Tillich in the phrase ultimate concerns will indicate, they are profoundly theological, whether or not they contain what in modern Western thought would be regarded as an explicit, worked out view of a God figure. So that's important. So everything we're talking about is theological, whether human beings want to admit it or not. As we look at our world today, as we look at the election coming up for president, as we look at the coronavirus, as we look at riots and race relations, and as we look at these things in our culture, the things that dominate the news headlines, as we look at sex scandals, as we look at all these things that come across our news media, we're implicitly asking a question about God. Where is God? What is he or she? You know, I mean, you know, we have this multiplicity of religious views out there. Now, all the news media I consume is not from a Christian perspective. You know, what's the, CBN? I haven't even caught CBN for a while. Pat Robertson, that was an attempt, and he's still around, 700 Club, to report the news from that Christian perspective. You know, the hard news would be reported, and then they would throw it over to Pat. Pat, what's your explanation of this news event, that news event? So Christians have done it in the past and continue to do it. So, but we have to bring this out explicitly. And, this takes some effort to think through this. Let's continue. Worldview, so Wright continues, worldview, in fact, embraces all deep-level human perceptions of reality, including the question of whether or not a god or gods exist, and if so, what he, she, or it, or they is like, and how such a being or such beings might relate to the world. Though the metaphor of sight can over-dominate the following analysis should make it clear that worldviews, in the sense I intend, include many dimensions of human existence other than simply theory. And then he gives 4 very helpful elements of a worldview. And in this show, Prophetic View, that I want to launch, I want to really try to incorporate these 4 elements in our analysis of the news. So I want to do 2 things. I want to go through the prophets of Israel and do a study of them and try to relate it to the current events we're under. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I also want to use the book of Revelation and teach the idealist view of the book of Revelation and apply the book of Revelation to current events. So that's another thing, but I don't want to go. Those of you who are ADHD, you probably enjoy my shows because I jump all over the place. If you're not, then it drives you crazy. All right, back to N.T. Wright. There are 4 things which worldviews characteristically do, in each of which the entire worldview can be glimpsed. First, as we have seen throughout this part of the book, worldviews provide the stories through which human beings view reality. Narrative is the most characteristic expression of worldview, going deeper than the isolated observation or fragmented remark. So, stories. We live in a storied existence, meaning that we interpret reality through a story of who's the hero, who's the villain, what's the plot here, what's the goal, what is success, what is failure. Okay, we think that way instinctively, and we tell stories to ourselves, and we interpret the events around us as a part of a grand narrative or unfolding story that we find ourselves in, or that the people that we're watching are finding themselves in, and we interpret reality that way. Okay, so story, that's the first element of a worldview, story. Second, from these stories, one can in principle discover how to answer the basic questions of human existence. So there's the second element is questions. So what are some of the questions? Who we are, where we are, what is wrong, and what is the solution? All cultures cherish deep-rooted beliefs, which can in principle be called up to answer these questions. All cultures have a sense of identity, of environment, of a problem which the way the world is and the way forward, a redemptive eschatology to be more precise, which will or may lead out of that problem. So eschatology, is a fancy Christian term, but it means we're looking toward a conclusion. What's this all driving toward, and what's the resolution? What's the hope? So Christian eschatology obviously is the second coming of Christ, the return of Christ. So in a systematic theology book or classic study of Christian doctrine, eschatology has to do with the end of the age and the return of Christ. But eschatology at a more basic level is like a sporting event's a great example. And I know sporting events are weird now, and there's no crowd. And I mean, I haven't been interested in sports. It's just, I don't know. It just takes not having a live audience there just makes it really weird. But anyway, there's an eschatology to a sporting event, which is what? The end of the game. So at a more basic level, a sporting event has the drama of it, the narrative of it, and that's why, sports announcers try to in a preview of a game, there's narratives, there's stories they tell. That's become more and more common in sporting events. Well, listen to the story of so-and-so and what he's overcome to get here. And here's this story and here's that story. And then, the eschatology of the game is, where we're looking forward toward the conclusion of this game. And then overall, who's going to win the championship and the resolution of that final outcome. That's eschatology. And we're all thinking it, whether explicit or implicit. As we watch the news, as we read the news, as we look at the world around us, we're asking ourselves the question, where does this all go? Where does this end? Like, what's the end game here? That's the implicit eschatology. And is there redemption? Will things be made right? Or do we live in a world where there is no redemption? Or, and this is really part of our problem in our culture today, is there a ultimate judge who will deliver justice? Or is there no ultimate judge, and that's why all justice must happen now? Because there is no final judge. There is no final judgment. There is no ultimate lawgiver. There is no God who will hold all people accountable. And that's why if people do horrendous things but get away with it, because we can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt what they did, and they are guilty, but we don't prove it in court of law, the only way that system works, the only way the American justice system works, innocent until proven guilty and beyond a reasonable doubt, is if you entrust the ultimate results to God, the creator and judge. Now, clearly in our culture, where is God, the creator and judge? Banished from the public arena. Banished from schools. People are not growing up with this simple idea of I am the Lord your God, and here are the 10 commandments, for example. So, and that lawlessness is being reflected in the culture. And many of the movements for quote-unquote social justice and quote-unquote racial justice are fueled by the fact that they do not believe that God will judge. So we must judge now. We must have justice now, because we don't entrust final justice to God because we don't believe in God. We don't believe in God. Okay, sorry, I digress. To recognize this in relation to culture, so we're talking about the questions and the solution to questions. Who are we? Where are we? What's wrong? What's the solution? To recognize this in relation to cultures can be as enlightening as to recognize that another human being within one's own family or circle of acquaintance has a different personality type from our own. It liberates all concern from the constricting assumption that we are all or should be exactly alike. Yeah, why do we make that assumption that everyone should think like us and act like us, especially in this arena of interacting with the world around us in news, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we have stories. Narrative is the first element of a worldview. Questions is the second element. Third, the stories that express the worldview and the answers which provide the question, identity, environment, evil, and eschatology are expressed, as we saw in the previous chapter, in cultural symbols. These can be both artifacts and events, festivals, family gatherings, and the like. In modern North America, the New York Victory Parade after a successful war brings together two of the most powerful symbols of the culture, the towering skyscrapers of business-oriented Manhattan and the heroes of the battle. Both in their own fashion demonstrate, promote, and celebrate the American way. In first-century Palestine, celebrating the Passover functioned similarly, with Jerusalem and the Temple taking the place of Manhattan, and the Passover sacrifice and meal taking the place of the Victory Parade. The buildings, instead of speaking of economic ethnic goals, spoke of religious ethnic ones. Instead of the celebration speaking of triumph achieved over the forces of darkness, it spoke of vindication yet to come. All cultures produce and maintain such symbols. They can often be identified when challenging them produces anger or fear. Such symbols often function as social and or cultural boundary markers. Those who observe them are insiders, and those who do not are outsiders. And these symbols, as the acted and visible reminders of a worldview that normally remains too deep for casual speech, form the actual grid through which the world is perceived. They determine how, from day to day, human beings will view the whole of reality. They determine what will and what will not be intelligible or assimilable within a particular culture, able to be assimilated. So that was a powerful paragraph. The symbols that we act out in daily life are a powerful indicator of our worldview. They're a powerful indicator of how we tackle and answer basic questions about reality. Fourth, so we had story, we had questions, we have symbols, and then what's the fourth? Worldview includes a praxis, a way of being in the world. Praxis, Praxis. The implied eschatology of the fourth question, what is the solution, necessarily entails action. Conversely, the real shape of someone's worldview can often be seen in the sort of actions they perform, particularly if the actions are so instinctive or habitual as to be taken for granted. The choice of a life aim, to make money, to raise a family, to pursue a vocation, to change society or the world in a particular way, to live in harmony with the created order, to develop one's own inner world, to be loyal to received traditions, reflects the worldview held, and so do the intentions and motivations with which the overall aim goes to work. Inconsistency of aim and action does not invalidate this, but merely shows that the issue is complicated, and that the answer to the third question, what is wrong, should certainly include human muddledness. The British word, to be muddled. Worldviews are thus the basic stuff of human existence, the lens through which the world is seen, the blueprint for how one should live in it, and above all, the sense of identity and place which enables human beings to be what they are. To ignore worldviews, either our own or those of the culture we are studying, would result in extraordinary shallowness. We may set out the interacting functions of worldview as follows. And if you can see this, if you're watching, there's Wright's story, symbol, praxis, and questions, and he goes into more depth about this. And N.T. Wright is a prolific writer. Definitely don't agree with everything he says, of course, but he's very helpful on these types of issues. So as we bring this episode to a close, let's just get just a taste here. Let me open up Bible Works if you're watching, and look at Isaiah chapter 1 and read it, and then just apply to our modern situation, because that's what I want to try to do, is look at the current events, make some comments on those current events of that week. And as we move toward the presidential election, which is going to be a bunch of stuff that comes out. And then we got these riots, and we still got coronavirus out there. So, how do we interpret what is going on in our world? Where's God? What's God up to? And remember, as we read in Calvin, our task is to study how God has responded to human behavior in the past. And how do we know that? Well, from the sacred, inerrant, infallible, holy scriptures, which are the only source of divine theopneustos, God-breathed revelation about history. All other attempts at history are constrained by human fallibility. Although history can be known. There's a form of skepticism that says you can't even know any history because of human bias. But anyway, Isaiah chapter 1. The vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So Isaiah's prophecy is rooted in historical circumstances. That's very important. That's why it starts off that way. And then here's the prophecy. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children have I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's cub, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, children who deal corruptly. They have forsaken the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are utterly estranged. Why will you still be struck down? Why will you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head there is no soundness in it, but bruises and sores and raw wounds, and they are not pressed out or bound or softened with oil. Your country lies desolate, your cities are burned with fire. In your very presence foreigners devour your land. It is desolate, is overthrown by foreigners. And the daughter of Zion is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a lodge in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. So let's just stop there. So how far do we connect the experience of Israel as a nation rebelling against God to the United States of America, for example, and our rebellion against God? And how do you understand how God is dealing? I mean, is there a connection? Or is this only God dealing with Israel? Is God's judgment a reality in our land, as it was in the land of Israel during the time of Isaiah? Because here it clearly is in the scriptures. God is reacting to the rebellion of Israel against his law. In what ways have our society, and that's the thing, does God deal with, we know as a Christian that God deals with individuals and individual sin and brings individuals to judgment. And all of us will be brought to individual judgment for our sin. But the question is, does God also deal with nations? Does God deal with larger groups and their collective corporate sin? Now, in the prophets, I think it's very clear. Yes, he does. Now, is he doing that today? That's the question. And how do we apply? So, this is some very... Coronavirus, does that have to do with God's judgment? These riots, does that have to do with God's judgment? Who God gives us as presidential candidates, is that God's judgment? These are some of the answers that I want this new content, this new episode, this new series, The Prophetic View, to address. How do we look at these current events and see the action of God in them? Okay? We continue in Isaiah. If the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we should have been like Sodom and become Gomorrah. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the teaching of God, you people of Gomorrah. Now, what's this a reference to, by the way? Remember, Sodom and Gomorrah, totally wicked, vile city, of which a cry went out to God. And God himself came down with two angels, spoke to Abraham, okay? And then those two angels went and rained fire upon the city. But what went on there? Well, Abraham pleaded for and interceded for his nephew Lot. And he asked the question, Lord, will you destroy a city if there's 10 righteous in it, and then 8 righteous? And then, he talks him down to, and then basically God gets Lot out of there before he destroys it. How does that connect with modern America? Okay. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the teaching of our God, you peoples of Gomorrah. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings, of rams, and the fat of well-fed beasts. I do not delight in blood of bulls, of lambs, of goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required of you this trampling of my courts? Bring no more vain offerings. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, and the calling of convocations. I cannot endure iniquity in the solemn assembly. Your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. So, the religion, meaning the worship, the public worship, the worship of the people, is always addressed and confronted by the prophets. And God speaks to the prophets to tell his people that their religious services, their public religion, their public worship is corrupt, and it's coming from a wrong motive. And any Christian worldview analysis of current events has to take in the state of the public expression of the church and make commentary on the public expression of the church. What is going on in the United States of America? What's going on with the church and the pastors and the religious leaders and the Christian leaders? And what is their response? What are they saying we should do? There's a rebuke of that. And then there's always a call to repentance. So listen to Isaiah here. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil of your deeds from before my eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they are as red as crimson, they shall be like wool. So there's always this call to repentance and faith everywhere in the prophets. So there's a calling out sin, but offering the hope of forgiveness, offering the hope of God's forgiveness. And then he continues, if you are willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be eaten by the sword. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken. How the faithful city has become a whore, she who was full of justice. Righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your best wine mixed with water. Your princes are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and runs after gifts. They do not bring justice to the fatherless, and the widow's cause does not come to them. Therefore the Lord declares, the Lord of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, I will get relief from my enemies and avenge myself on my foes. So when you hear Christian commentary on American news events, do we talk about and we hear about, oh, well, America, the morality of America is so bad today compared to previous generations. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, what's the moral formation of the youth of America? I mean, these people that are running the streets and have no qualms about physically assaulting people, burning down buildings, throwing rocks at the police, cursing out people, just going insane, looting. I mean, what's their moral formation? I mean, is this just the fruit of, starting in the 90s with MTV and the media that people consume and the music and the culture that by and large is godless, that glorifies violence, it glorifies sex, it's sexual sin. Is this just the fruit of that? Because when you watch these things of these riots and these people, like where is their moral formation? Is there even any moral formation? And was there one time when our culture, it would have been unheard of for this? And then, of course, any commentary has to do with the Satan and the principalities and powers and the dark forces. And, many times we as the Reformed kind of, we don't talk about that enough, that there is a satanic element to all of this. Like the anarchists are satanic. I mean, anarchy is satanic. So that's how we can, everyone runs after bribes. I mean, this, our political system, I mean, the money, the way that money is used to secure power, and how it influences decisions, and there's not enough justice going on because of money and bribery and gifts, and how gigantic the government systems are and how much money flows through them. Therefore, the Lord of hosts declares, I will get relief on my enemies and avenge myself on my foes. I will turn my hand against you and will smelt away your drosses with lye and remove all your alloy. I will restore your judges as at first and your counselors at the beginning. Afterwards, you shall be called a city of righteousness, a faithful city. Zion shall be redeemed by justice, and those in her who repent by righteousness. But rebels and sinners shall be broken together, and those who forsake the Lord shall be consumed. For they shall be ashamed of the oaks that you desired, and you shall blush for the gardens that you have chosen. For you shall be like an oak whose leaf withers, and like a garden without water. And the strong shall become tinder, and his work a spark, and both of them shall burn together, with none to quench them. So that's just Isaiah chapter 1. And how do we apply that to modern-day America? How do we apply that to the circumstances we see? Is the coronavirus an act of God's judgment? Is the unleashing of these riots an act of God's judgment? How do we answer these questions? Where is God? Is he up in heaven, not wanting any of this bad stuff to happen, and just helplessly going, it's the free will of man, and I want to change this, but they have to let me, and is God's hand in any sense? I mean, functionally, many Christians are deists. What do I mean by that? Well, deism classically says that God is the creator, but he wound up the clock, meaning he wound up the laws of nature, and then he kind of stepped away and lets the world run on its own, occasionally intervening. But by and large, human history is simply and mainly a conglomeration of human free will choices. So human history is not guided by God. and his divine decree and his plan unfolding even in the choices of human beings, even in the sinful choices of human beings. Rather, God is up in heaven kind of observing human nature, and there might be an ultimate end goal that will be accomplished, but that's certainly not what's happening currently, and that there's a lot of stuff that God wants to happen that's just not happening. And there's a lot of things that are happening that God does not want to happen. And he's observing the sinful state of humanity, and he's saying, man, this is not what I wanted, and this is not accomplishing my will. And this is where classic Reformed theology makes the distinction between the secret will and the revealed will, or the decretive will and the preceptive will. So God's will, as we understand it, is expressed in what's called his preceptive will. That's what we can perceive, meaning God has his commands, and he commands us to live in a certain way, and that's how we should order our lives. Now, behind that is the decretive will of God, where all things happen according to the counsel of his will, Ephesians 1:11. That the lot is cast in the lap, but the result is from the Lord. And we have all kinds of scriptures that talk about how God is actually behind the scenes in control, even in what appears to be the most wicked, vile events that seem like utter failure and destruction of God's will are actually the accomplishing of his will. And of course, as Christians, what's the ultimate example of that? It's the crucifixion of Jesus, where Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles and the people of Israel all conspired to murder the Son of God, yet they did whatever God's hand and plan predestined to take place. They carried out God's plan in their evil, wicked actions. Acts 4:27 and 28, if you want to study that. So these serve as a base of operations. And then, this is just a theory. I want to do an episode next week where we're going to go over current events. And we're going to look at it from a Christian worldview, and I'll just give it a shot, see how it goes. Maybe some people will be interested, maybe they won't. But the other thing is, and I've realized that I can't fall into doing this, putting this content out there online for clicks and audiences and likes. And I got to do it because I want to leave a legacy. I want to leave things behind for my children to listen to here's what my dad said about this, and here's what and just leave something for someone to watch. And I back up all this stuff onto flash drives and stuff so I can have them not just hosted on the internet, but there for posterity. So Prophetic View, the Prophetic View, I think is what I'm going to title it, and just go over current events from a biblical perspective. And that's what I hope to do. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Once again, stay tuned. I'm going to pump out more content on doctrinal issues as I've been doing. But I wanted to just get this episode out there and just introduce you to my idea of starting something called the Prophetic View. And I look forward to it. Thanks a lot. Subscribe, like, share. Find me on iTunes, Spotify, etc., etc. And thank you, and God bless.